Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to Sika Stand. Today we're going to talk about how you can program your assistance exercises for strength training. Now, my name is Owen. I am a strength coach, powerlifting coach, and we've helped people across numerous levels and varying degrees of ability for years and years at this stage. And there's some principles we've learned about assistance training that hopefully you can apply in your own training and improve your assistance training work and hopefully improve your 1RM strength because of that. First, let's define assistance work. So assistance work is anything that's going to improve our main strength lifts. So generally this is squat, bench, deadlift, strict press, maybe front squat, large barbell compound movements that we're looking to increase our 1RM capability on. Now you might be pedantic and say, well, my favorite lift is actually 1RM rear delt flies, but we can actually still apply the same principles that we're going to talk about today for that, even if you have a very strange lift in your 1RM catalog that you want to improve upon, we can still apply the other assistance exercise to that. So in that case, barbell rows and deadlifts would be your assistance work and your 1RM would be rear delt flies instead of the inverse. But hopefully you're not a contrarian and we're here to see what can we do really productively for our assistance work. Now when it comes to our assistance work, we've got essentially 4 different categories that we'll probably need to think about throughout our training career. The first is strength. Second is hypertrophy or lean mass accrual. The third is stability. And the last then is going to be prehab and rehab lumped together. So when it comes to assistance work for strength training, more often than not, we're going to be lumping in strength and hypertrophy into the same category. And there's some good reasons for that. So first of all, your thought there might be, if I'm always combining strength and hypertrophy, am I going to be losing a little bit of that most gains I could get in my strength or the most I could get in my hypertrophy? And the answer to that is very, very slightly, almost imperceptible to you, and it's something that's never going to make a difference, and we've good reasons for combining those. If we were 100% hypertrophy based athletes, first I would question, why are you watching this channel? The second thing I would say is that when we're looking at hypertrophy training, and if we look at people who talk about hypertrophy and we look at the research and they're talking about, stretch mediated gains or proximity to failure, really what we're looking at and the differences in those groups is a very, very small percentage of change in hypertrophy over the course of a couple of months, or if even the studies go that long, we're talking about 1, 2, maybe 3% change in lean mass gain over a couple of months. And realistically, we don't have the time, or we don't want to dedicate the time or the capacity to maximizing an extra 2% in hypertrophy if it means we're not increasing our strength for our main lifts. So the first place we start when we're looking at strength and hypertrophy is we need to be progressing something. Now, there's a couple of different areas we can progress when it comes to strength and hypertrophy for assistance work. Usually when we're looking at the main lifts, we're looking at progressive overload of weight, but there's a couple of different areas we can look at for assistance work. So one, weight is one of the main ones. Volume, increasing that volume week to week is another great option. We can also increase the range of motion, and then to a certain degree, we can increase the difficulty of that exercise. But by and large, we're going to be looking at weight, volume, and range of motion to increase those. So what does that look like? Let's say we take, for example, maybe we'll take dumbbell bench. So this is one of the ones we're looking at, and we need a bit more muscle mass in our upper body. Our coach said we need more lean tissue up here. You need a bit more mass in your pecs, but you also need some more strength. You need to make use of assistance work. So you could just bench and you'd get a lot of that work done, but there's a certain amount of bench that you can do, and there's a certain amount of fatigue that bench accrues, and there's a certain change in that fatigue you would get from doing a different assistance exercise, which is why pretty much every strength athlete in the world over does assistance work, because we can get an extra benefit with a slightly different trail of fatigue on our body. So that's why we would do assistance work, is to maximize all these avenues for pretty large bang for a buck. So you are benching and you're going to use something like incline dumbbell bench press or flat dumbbell bench press. You can increase the weight from week to week, so you'll start with 5 by 10 on the dumbbell bench press with 10 kilos in each hand. Next week you can quite simply just stay at 5 by 10 and go 12 kilos. Following week you can stay again at 5 by 10 and go 14 kilos, and again then that fourth week you can stay at 5 by 10 and go to 16 kilos. Then you can assess what's going on. You can assess, is it feasible next week to look at increasing the weight, or will I need to increase the volume? There's a couple of different avenues available to you here. You can reset. You can go back to 10 kilos. You can do 5 by 12. Then you can go 12 kilos and do 5 by 12. You can go 14 kilos and do 5 by 12. And then you can go to 16 again. And you might have finished at 5 by 10 at 16 kilos. Now you can try finish at 5 by 12. And these are all very viable, good ways of increasing your strength and hypertrophy from that assistance exercises, because we're getting some progressive overload, not just in the weight, even though we're progressing the weight, but we're also getting an increase in the volume. Now you can do this another way. We can start at 5 by 8 at 10 kilos on this flat dumbbell bench press. The following week we can stay at 10 kilos per hand and we can go 5 by 12. The following week then we can go 5 by 15, 5 by 18. Now it becomes a little bit difficult to progress reps after several weeks. Eventually you'll run into a stage where you have a sufficient level of difficulty that we're getting some benefit from the exercise. So of course you could start with 1 kilo either hand, but you're not going to get it to a practically challenging rep range or stimulus from that exercise if you start too light. So you need to start in a relatively smart place in terms of how intense that exercise is for you, and then you select an exercise and progression that you think in 4 to 5 weeks or maybe more that you're going to end up at a stage where it's going to be pretty challenging by the end. Now the important thing here, because we're lumping in strength and hypertrophy, is we do want to get to a stage every so often that we're getting pretty close to failure, but we're definitely not going to failure very, very frequently. And while that might be the best for pure hypertrophy training, it's not the best for pure strength training, but more importantly, it's not the best for the rest of your strength training, your 1RM lifts. So if you are doing a deadlift peak in 8 weeks time, and in 6 weeks time, you're going to take your stiff-legged deadlifts with dumbbells to failure, you're going to have a lot of hamstring fatigue, you're going to have a lot of posterior chain fatigue, and you're going to mess up your technique in the preceding sessions for your deadlift. So while you might have gotten a little bit of extra lean mass or potential for extra lean mass in the hamstrings, for example, there, or the glutes, you've messed up your peak, or you've severely impacted your peak for your heavy deadlift in 2 weeks time or 1 week's time when it wasn't a great idea. So volume gets us a lot of the way there. Increasing the intensity or the weight gets us a lot of the way there. And so in that fashion, we're getting a lot of the benefit of strength and hypertrophy, but we're being super conscious of where that fatigue is going and how it's going to impact the rest of our training. And in this case, we're always thinking, okay, am I progressing here? Good. Is this sufficiently challenging? Absolutely. Am I severely impacting my squat or my bench or my deadlift? Not really. There's sufficient recovery time because you've set it up that way. Then in that case, you can go, this is sufficient training for my assistance work, and as a result, I'm getting the benefits without jeopardizing my main lifts. Traditionally in strength training, we're going to go for 1RM. We're going to start with higher volume when we're going to increase that intensity. And if we're looking to increase the strength of a particular assistance exercise, let's say it is that pressing motion with the dumbbells or the hinging motion with the dumbbells, we could push for a 1RM, and sometimes that's useful. But again, it's similar to pushing to failure with those higher reps for hypertrophy. If we go for really heavy singles, we're not going to get as much lean mass accrual as we could get if we had a bit more volume. And we're also going to negatively impact the rest of our training in those particular lifts if we push that assistance exercise too close to a heavy single. I will say with a caveat with this, in some cases with larger muscle groups, we can go relatively low. So normally we stick into a rep range between 6 and 12 reps for the assistance exercises, but sometimes we'll go maybe 3 to 5. For example, if I have powerlifters who have decent leg strength and we find it responds well, we'll do something like Bulgarian split squats, but we'll go pretty heavy. So if someone can squat 230 kilos low bar, I've had an athlete get up to 150 kilos for sets of 3 in the Bulgarian split squat. Typically, that's quite heavy for that exercise, heavy for pretty much anyone, but we found that it did benefit him and it didn't really severely impact his fatigue for the rest of his training. Even then though, within the last 2 or 3 weeks close to a peak, we massively dropped off those weights and volume on that assistance exercise to ensure the freshness was there for that heavy squat. So we can push that strength aspect of the assistance exercises, but we really need to be conscious then, of course, as well of the form we're using and the technique we're using on that assistance exercise. Because if we're drastically changing the assistance work, let's say we're doing rear delt flies, for example, and we are going for a really heavy single rear delt fly, realistically, there's a good chance you're going to end up swinging the barbell, swinging those plates, using a lot of body English and not really getting any benefit to that particular exercise. So some exercises are really suited to maybe go a little bit closer to that 3 to 5 rep range. And then other exercises are much more suited staying in that 8 to 12, maybe 15 rep range for most of your training. Now, the last place we can change strength and hypertrophy is increasing range of motion without drastically changing the weights we're using. So we could start with weighted push-ups, or we could even start with unweighted push-ups. Then we could add weight to those weighted push-ups. Then we can add a range of motion to those weighted push-ups by doing deficit push-ups. And then we can go further again and increase that range of motion further by increasing the depth of those deficit push-ups. So we've got a lot of different avenues available to us, a lot of different viable avenues. We could do this with dumbbell rows. We could go for partial rows from blocks, for example, with a barbell. Or then we could move to stiff-legged deficit barbell rows where we're getting a lot of thoracic flexion, and then moving into a lot of thoracic extension where we're getting a lot of range of motion. So you need to evaluate what it is you're looking for from that assistance exercise, what that weak area is, what you need from that assistance exercise, and then look at, can I increase the weight of these? Can I increase the volume of these? Or maybe can I increase the range of motion to get more benefit without having to increase the weight? Because that total tonnage, or that huge amount of weight, if we're doing really heavy weight on our assistance exercises and really heavy weight on our main lifts, while it can be quite useful, can also be very fatiguing. Now, before we move on, I want to share with you an excellent way of progressing your 1RM on your body weight movements. Now, this technically is drifting into the realm of increasing your 1RM, but generally a lot of people will use, and will use it with our athletes quite frequently, is something like a weighted pull-up or a weighted dip, where we're looking at these as an assistance exercise, but sometimes the client or the athlete wants to increase their 1RM and they want to make use of it for their lifting, which is very viable, but they also want to go for heavy single every so often. So one thing I'll use is very, very simple, but it is so productive. Let's say we take weighted chin-ups. We start with 5x3, for example. Just take an example at 5 kilos on that weighted chin-up. Next week we'll go 5x4. Next week we might go 4x5. We'll increase the volume or increase the reps per set, staying at that same weight until we get to something maybe like 5x5 or 5x6 or 4x8. Something quite pretty high volume, but not crazy high volume on that. Then what we'll do is we'll reset back to that 5x3 and increase the weight. So we might go 5x3 at 5 kilos, 5x4 at 5 kilos, 5x5 at 5 kilos. Then we might go 4x6 at 5 kilos. And then we'll decide we've had sufficient time with this weight that we can move up in weight. So next week we go 7 kilos. Then we start with 5x3, 5x4, 5x5. Then we'll rinse and repeat this for several months on end. And once we feel like we kind of want to go for a single, or the athlete wants to test that single, we simply move through these progressions. And let's say we got to 5x5 at 10 kilos. All we start doing then is traditional periodization, or traditional peaking towards a single. And we go 5x5 at 10 kilos. Then we'll go 5x3 at 12 kilos, 3x3 at 14 kilos, 3x1 at 16 kilos, and then we'll go for a max. And you can repeat this ad nauseum. And this is an excellent way to increase your 1RM strength in those bodyweight or traditionally bodyweight exercises, like weighted dips, like weighted chin-ups, like weighted pull-ups. Stuff like that responds incredibly well to this loading scheme. Now, stability. Stability is an interesting topic in the S&C world, the strength training world. So let's take a definition of what we're looking for in stability in relation to strength training. And this is our ability to be very, very secure and solid in a position. And I think that's the best way we can put that. So if we take, for example, the bottom of the bench press. A lot of times lifters, when they get close to the last 2 or 3 inches of the bench press, we might see a little wobble and deviation of the bar pat. Now, this isn't optimal because we're not going to be as secure. We're changing that bar pat. We're making our positions inconsistent. We're making it hard for us to have consistent technique, which makes us hard to refine our technique and puts us probably in less optimal positions to press off of. So one of the ways we can increase stability is simply strength training, and doing traditional assistance work and doing your main lift will increase your stability with the lifts. But if you find that it's just really not cutting the mustard, or your stability problems are particularly bad, there is a couple of options available to us, and they largely will depend on time under tension, for want of a better word. And what does this mean? So we're going to be looking at stuff like pause reps here, stuff like slow eccentrics, a pause, then a really slow concentric. And while we're still getting some strength and lean mass from this, really what we're training is this kind of neurological aspect or skill-based aspect of the lift. So we're not actually making huge physical changes to that lift in that regard, but we are making sure that we're securing that particular technique that we want. So let's say we have that issue of the bench press where we're super unstable near the bottom of the bench. Let's say we'll take something very useful like an extreme range of motion deficit push-up, which is one of my favorites for people who have that problem, by the way. So if you're very unsecure, you're really lacking stability in the bottom portion of the bench press, a great exercise, of course, is bench pressing. But also another fantastic exercise is very large range of motion deficit push-ups, where we're talking 3-4 plates aside, and we're at maximum range of motion here while still maintaining quite good posture and technique. And what we'll do, super slow eccentric, we're talking 7 to 10 second eccentric, quite a long pause at the bottom, 3 to 5 seconds, and then really slow concentric, we're pushing up. And I want you to do that week on week. You can wait it if you want, but the stability aspect is something that is largely a skill-based problem. And then the slower we make a lot of these exercises, the better we can make it for ourselves. Because if we slow it down, skills take a lot of their difficulty from speed, and the slower we do a skill, generally the better we're able to do this. So think about this more as, of course, strength training for sure. Maybe you need some lean mass to stabilize that muscle. You could be hypermobile, for example, and you need a little bit more muscle mass and strength to come along with that to reduce your hypermobility. But also think of stability primarily as a skill. And while we're doing traditional assistance exercises, we're doing traditional strength training, on this particular skill aspect, slowing down those speeds, eccentrics, concentrics, pause reps, really gives an opportunity to reinforce and improve on this skill. So you could look at your assistance exercise here as the main lift, but slowed down. So it's not necessarily back to an isolation or variation of that lift. We could quite simply do some bench press where we have 5 second eccentric, really slowly down, 5 second pause, and a really slow press off, then a 5 second concentric, for example. So it's not necessarily that we're confined to assistance work and isolation movements, but when we're looking at stability, there's a couple of different aspects, and we could do this with that extreme deficit push-up, for example. We could do this with dumbbell bench press, or any number of options available to us. But when it comes to stability, try and think of it as much as a skill component as much as a strength component. The strength component is very, very important, but you're probably taking care of that currently with normal assistance work and normal strength training, which is probably why you're watching this video. But on top of that, then we're looking at that time under tension aspect, as cliche as that sounds. Now, lastly, we come to the last section of our assistance work and why we might be doing it and how to program it, and that is rehab and prehab. So I'll cut to the chase with rehab stuff. How you do your assistance work for rehab is probably you should do what you're told. Now, this is more difficult than it sounds because, first of all, we need to find someone who's smart enough and who we trust enough to tell us what to do. I'll give you an example, though. Let's say you've had a major surgery and you've been to the hospital. One of the best places you can find good information about your specific surgery is probably the resident physiotherapist or whatever specific therapist they have on site. The chances are they've seen a lot of these exercises, and I want you to quite simply follow what they say and follow the recommendation. You would be surprised how often people don't do this and how good at their job they are at doing this by telling you what you should be doing. And if you follow the recommendations in general, they'll probably put you on a good path. So my advice for rehab programming is do as you're told. The big idea of rehab is simply overloading your current stimulus so you can return to play in your particular movements. So you're just trying to progress intensity, range of motion, weight, time under tension, any one of these different aspects until we get to a better place with rehab. So that's largely what we're looking for. Rehab is progressive overload. It follows the same principles of normal assistance training, but we're probably really far back on the tier, on the ladders of how simple some things are. Now, when it comes to prehab is a somewhat controversial topic. Some people don't think prehab exists. I think that's not a great way of looking at this because there's certainly some things we can do that will reduce our risk of injury. But generally, when we talk about prehab here, usually what prehab is your rehab that was your rehab. Now the pain is gone. And we generally recommend you do your rehab for a preceding number of months until you feel like the problem is sufficiently gone. Very often we'll see is people will do their rehab, then they'll end up in a position where they've recovered from that injury or that pain or that surgery. They no longer have pain, but they're still doing the stimulus that caused them that pain, or they're still doing the stimulus, which is probably strength training, that caused you to get surgery in the first place. So it's probably a prudent idea to keep doing the work that probably helped you rehab in the first place. Now, it's hard to define exactly in all cases what is good rehab, but if you found there was a series of exercises that didn't take particularly long to recover from, then in that case, it's probably a good idea to treat them as your new prehab. And I would say quite literally do this for several months. A minimum of 3 months after your rehab is finished, I want you to keep doing your rehab that is now your prehab. Follow similar progressions, try and overload it to a certain extent, and treat that as your assistance exercise. If you want to take the thinking about your own training, if you want someone else to do this for you for your assistance work, check out the Sika Strength app on iOS and Android. We have a plethora of strength training programs. We have our main powerlifting program. We have specific squat, bench, press programs. 2 press programs out. The second variation of the pressing program is available now on the Sika Strength app. You have access to all the programs for your subscription every month. You get a 7-day free trial, and you get dynamic loading adjustment. You get a coach bot. You get access to the Facebook stream. So you are getting value for money, but not also value for your money in regards to the product offered to you. You are just going to get better, and that's the main reason you're here. And using those apps is to add kilos, in most cases, to your 1RM. So we hope you make use of that, and we hope you enjoy it. Check it out at Sika Strength, iOS and Android.